Hello, and welcome to episode 81 of Zion's Finest, a Shatterpoint podcast. I'm your temporary stand-in host, Scott Nielsen, joined today by our wonderful brother on the East Coast, Sam Sweeten.
Hello, hello.
Hello. And today, we, in honor of Adepticon being next week, at least it's next week right now. It'll probably still be next week by the time this goes out, but maybe it'll be the week of. We wanted to do a bit of a different episode today about sort of tournament etiquette and the controversial, kind of not fun topic of cheating and foul play. So it's going to be an interesting one.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah. So first off, we'd like to encourage everyone to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really helps kind of get us out there, build the podcast. And then we also want to call it a few upcoming events. These ones are just going to be Utah specifically. On April 12th at Gamers Asylum in Ogden, there's going to be a small premier tournament. So if you're local in the area or in the Wasatch Front, we'd love to see you come out. The Alt Art Spectres are going to be part of the prizes there, if you've seen the really cool wanted poster Spectre order cards. So that'll be a cool event. And then we're also going to have an event on May the 4th at Demolition Games. That's currently planned in progress there, so that those deals can change. But if you're a local to Utah or you're going to be traveling around that time, we would love to see you and come out and get some cool swag. So, kind of diving right in. So, obviously, Adepticon is going. It's the world tournament, right? So it's going to be the first one for Shatterpoint. We are all deeply sad that we're not going to be attending because we all went to LVO and we only have so much literal capital and marital capital to expend in a given period. But we are super excited for everyone that is going to be making it there. And for some people, this is going to be like their first really big tournament. And also for some people, they've had a few tournaments, but it still kind of can be a little bit new. And there's some things that are dicey issues that can kind of come up. So we want to do an episode really about sort of tournament etiquette, best practices, and how to perform well and be a good sportsman going into these tournaments. So first, I'm going to talk like how do you comport yourself? Like how how can you be a gracious winner and a gracious loser? So I'm going to kick it to Sam. Sam, what do you think it means to be sort of gracious in winning and gracious in losing?
I think that being gracious in winning and losing really comes with it's a lot about being polite. It's a lot about being aware of what type of vibe is a loose word, but I think it actually works here. What type of vibe you're giving to your opponent? Are you coming across as angry at them, or that are you coming across as a grandiose or kind of a self-importance in your win, right? You never want to put down your opponent because you beat them, and you never want to seem like you're actually angry at your opponent after losing, right? So I think it's just kind of being gracious is kind of a check to yourself. How am I presenting myself to the person across the table? I think is part of it. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think specifically, I think it is about recognizing that it is a game. We are moving plastic figures around a board and rolling dice and pretending that they're pew-pewing each other. And I think recognizing that is kind of step one. It is not the end of the world, win or lose. Like it's important to you, but it is not anything to harm someone over. It's not anything to get, up in arms about. But I also think that it is about recognizing that people have spent money and traveled, and they are passionate about this. And I think there's a balance there. I think that as a winner, you should respect that variance played a piece in your game for your win, especially if it's high level play where, we've talked about this before, that when two people who are playing equally good lists, who don't make mistakes, who are equally competent strategists and tacticians, a lot of the time that game comes down to variance. And being a winner and saying, hey, you had some bad dice luck there. That's really unfortunate. I think recognizing that, yeah, sometimes like it is your opponent maybe should have won even, and vice versa. If you lose, like never say to your opponent, well, you only won because of dice, or well, if you hadn't done that, right? It's about saying, hey, you played super well. Recognize, be humble on your part and recognize the skill on your opponent's part. Pay a compliment to them. Don't, build yourself up needlessly. I think that's a big part about, you know, being a good winner and being a good loser.
Yeah, I think connected to this is, I agree with what you said, Scott. And connected to this is the idea of tilt, right? That the idea that after losing or variance breaks against you, people get tilted, right? And that's a normal part of the game experience, especially with something you care about a lot. And different people will experience tilt to different degrees, right? So some
Yeah,
people are more inclined to get tilted quicker than others. And if it's your first tournament or your first like competitive experience, maybe you really don't know that about yourself. But I think part of tournament etiquette is trying to understand how you respond to situations like that and knowing how to best respond in a social situation so that your tilt doesn't create an unpleasant experience for those around you, right?
absolutely. Absolutely. I also think one thing that I'm thinking about as well is it's important to recognize where you as a player are at. Are you at a casual tournament? Are you at a big official GT? Right? Like it is the case that if you are at Adepticon, if you're at LVO, if you're at the SoCal Open, if you're at, all these different GTs, people are there to compete, right? People
Yeah.
are there to win. And you know what? There are things that in a casual tournament, I mean, I played in a tournament last weekend where I just told my opponent, like, they screwed something up, and I was like, "Oh, you just redo it. Like, just just move your model back. I don't care." Like, because it's like this is a casual tournament. Like I'm not really going to hold you to some things that I would, but expect that at a bigger event like Adepticon, it's going to be, hey, you moved your model, right? But one of the things I'm going to call out our friend Daimyo Matt, that I think this is such just a gentleman move, is he says to his opponent, he says, hey, let me know what you're trying to do, and I can, assist if you need assistance, or I can help understand, and we can talk through it. He's not here to like touch move chess. Oh, you technically did this. If you're saying my goal is to get within range 5 of this figure, and you could, but you didn't move it exactly perfectly, he's like, hey, you could have moved there and be there. You don't necessarily need to do that, be that gracious, but I personally think that's the standard that I'd hold myself to. Communicate what you want to do. If it's possible, we'll figure it out how to do it. You don't need to make moves for your opponent, but I do think that that's just a really good example of being a gracious player, while also respecting that if you roll dice or you pull a card, like, yeah, you're held to it, right? It is
Yeah.
what it is. And I think one of the tougher parts, and one of the reasons why I wanted to have this episode exactly, is there's kind of an issue, and this will come up a lot through this episode, of as a good player, as a player who is being a good tournament goer, when do you call a judge, right? And it's kind of obvious in some cases where it's like, hey, how does this rule work? Call a judge, right?
Yeah.
Or hey, like what is the errata on this? Call a judge. But there are some questions of some other pieces, when to make sure that everyone's kind of having a good time, when do you call a judge? So, Sam, what are the kind of the instances that maybe you have been unsure if you should call a judge, and maybe you end up doing so or end up not doing so and kind of regretting it?
I'm trying to think back to my initial days of playing tournament miniatures games. And I think looking back initially when I first started playing, I think MCP was my first miniatures tournament game that required range rulers. And I think at first I was hesitant to call judges over to double check ranges. Now that's something that I'm very comfortable with, that it's just like, hey, things are close, let's just get a judge. That I just do that out of habit. But as a new player, I wasn't sure if that was something I was a bit more hesitant about. I wasn't sure if that was that. I kind of thought if judges were just there to be rules arbiters, not necessarily there for measurements. And I kind of learned that was part of what they do. And so that's something, I guess, to a newer tournament goer, first time tournament goer. Hey, you can call someone over just like, hey, I want to double check on this range, or, am I within? Does this movement get me to this spot? Things like that, I think, are something initially. What about you, Scott? What are some
Yeah.
things that along those same lines for you?
So 100% range and movement, also placement. Can you push this person off? Can you get off a ladder? I think that the general rule that I follow, that I think generally everyone should follow, is you and your opponent should agree on all ranges, all movement. There should never be a question of whether or not you have range. Uh, in a situation, it should always be, if you say, "Hey, do I have range 5 here?" If your opponent says yes, cool, proceed. If no, if you feel like you do and they don't, call a judge. Because
Yeah,
the thing that you want to avoid more than anything else is putting social pressure on your opponent or feeling social pressure on yourself to concede one way or the other for the game. Because
yeah,
it is often the time where people will be like, "Hey man, really? Like, I definitely have range 5." And it's like, I don't think you do. But you might feel social pressured into saying, "Oh, okay, I guess you do." And it's like, okay, well, if you end up losing that match, you're gonna feel kind of bad about that, right? Or there's gonna be a situation where you can have bad feelings at the end. But if you call a judge over, then it's an objective third party. They are there to give their best opinion. And whether I agree with it, it's not something you can hold against your opponent. It's something that, hey, that was a third party decided, and them's the breaks. And so that helps there. I also think, and I want to save this sort of piece for a little bit later. The times when most people, I think, don't call for a judge is times when they suspect sort of foul play, either
yeah.
slow play or cheating, or any of the forms that cheating can take, and they don't call a judge over. And I think part of it is, and this is a big part of why I wanted to do this episode, is that there is a lack of comfortability with calling judges for those types of things, because it is inherently kind of accusatory to your opponent, and that can feel awkward, particularly if you are a conflict avoidant person and you're like, I don't know what to do here. And I think it is so important for the health of a game to make sure that people feel like they can utilize the levers of competitive play, in this case a judge, in order to ensure a fair, even playing field.
I think that's an excellent point, Scott. It's something that, to when I think about like where I am right now, I still would feel some sort of social anxiety and pressure about calling a judge for that reason when I really shouldn't. I I think that an analogy that I have to kind of put into my head about judges is that they are in many like relating it to sports, they are a referee, and a referee is there to note when a rule wasn't followed correctly, and then to apply whatever punishment or restriction is for that game, right? Like a ref says, "Hey, you broke that rule. In basketball, we're going to give you some free throws, right? In soccer, we're going to give you a penalty kick." And that when in sports, that's a common thing. And though there's anger at the refs, it's no longer anger directed usually still at the other team, right? It's just that, hey, they noted that this rule was broken in sports, often like intentionally. And it's a different, you know, sports are this isn't a perfect metaphor, but somebody intentionally did something wrong and the penalty was implied. And judges can perform much the same function in miniatures gaming as they do in sports. That's where I'm getting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is also the case that if we don't document scenarios where foul play happens, there's no real mechanism to address them. There's this amazing metaphor. Well, I wouldn't say a metaphor, just more of a parallel example where I heard someone talking about certain election violations, right? So this was talking about Elon Musk giving out $1 million lotteries, right, for people that were registered to vote. And that was a lot of legal scholars basically said, hey, this is really clearly against like election law. This pretty clearly violates it. And I was listening to a legal scholar talk about this, and he says, yeah, they don't really care that it's illegal. And the reason why they don't care that it's illegal is because currently the punishment for this is a fine. This guy's given out $1 million a day. He does not care about a fine. That's just the price to do it. So you don't have an appropriate mechanism of deterrence. You don't have an appropriate punishment. So one of the things I say is if you report it after the fact and there's a warning, or you catch your opponent and say, hey, I saw you do that, don't do it again, then you deter them really from maybe doing it in the rest of the game, but you don't deter them from the next game, right? You
Yeah.
haven't actually stopped the problem, right? You have, moved the problem down the line. And so I think that a judge is that mechanism of deterrence to actually get in there and kind of stop that. So obviously, these are kind of best practices sort of holistically and attitude-wise. But I want to talk a little bit about how to actually, what you can do as a player to build trust with your opponent. Because I think that's so important to be able to say, hey, I want to conduct myself with dignity and I want to conduct myself with integrity so that my opponent never feels like they need to worry about me as a player. And I think
Yeah.
that is even recognizing that, like, hey, mistakes happen.
Mm-hmm.
People misread their dice.
Yeah.
You're 5 rounds in. You've been playing Shatterpoint for 12 hours. Oh, you read a symbol as a different symbol. Like, I get it, right? So, Sam, do you have anything that you do as a player to demonstrate your integrity, or things that you do to kind of keep things on the up and up that you would like to share as like a best practice?
Yeah. So to me, one of the first things, and this comes from playing card games, is I always present my deck to be cut. I It just starts off saying like, "Hey, we are, it's just putting your best foot forward of saying like, I am here to play the game by following the rules, and I don't want to do anything untoward or cheating like, right?" And I always I bring a dice tray to all my events because I want all my dice rolls to be just kind of confined to a certain spot, so nothing ends up getting behind terrain, so that dice don't have to be picked up and moved in order to see results. And I try and position that, space permitting, so that it's in a kind of closer to the center of our table play space. It's just a personal preference of mine, right? To have it more forward so it's easier for both players to see. And then just things that I'm throughout the game, I try to remember to just do things like check, hey, do we agree that this is within the same range? Or like just talking through the intent of where I'm trying to, hey, I'm trying to move within range 3, and then we can double check and see it, but just kind of walking through what I'm trying to do so that nothing comes across as untowards. And just trying to be open and clear in that communication. And sometimes I'm still going to make errors. I'm going to forget to say something. It's been a long day playing Shatterpoint, and and that's things can get muddy. I'm not immune to any of the mistakes that you brought up. It's been a long day. I miss a dice or something, but just having these things in, like, hey, here's a tray. It's in the center. It's easier for us to see, right? That helps, like, make it so there's not these instances where it's like, oh, that dice got rolled behind a building. Now my opponent can't see what it is. If I pick it up, did I twist it, right? Those can create these scenarios where someone can feel like they got cheated, or that there was the possibility that happened, even if they didn't. And I just try to avoid those as much as possible.
Absolutely. I love the offering to have your deck. It's something I do as well. It's actually an interesting piece to kind of talking with Kenny and referencing Daimyo Man again. So what I always do is say, would you like to cut my deck? I give someone the option. What Kenny says is Matt will just hand someone the deck to cut. Like there's not even a question. And it is the kind of piece where it should be noted that nowhere in the rules does it say you must have your opponent cut your deck. And so this is something that, I have heard of someone who asked to have someone cut their deck and they got mad. And it was pretty clear that person probably had stacked their deck. So it is something where if your opponent is not willing to cut their deck, I'm not saying that you should call a judge over and say, they won't let me cut their deck. Because again, it's not part of tournament rules, but it's maybe something to keep an eye out for, right? Of just like, hey, if you ask them if you'd be willing to cut each other's decks and they refuse, put your radar on. But yeah, I custom ordered a dice tray. I really love this. So it's a cool piece of wood. It's a rectangular dice tray, and it has a rolling area, and then it has a smaller little rectangular slit. And I've gotten into this habit because, we really don't want dice to go behind buildings. We don't want them to be obscured in any way. What I used to do is I would verbally confirm my dice before I'd touch them to my opponent. And our good friend Justin Chavez, a local Utah, who top 8 at LVO, really great player. Both he and his son are top players. Justin just doesn't touch his dice. And he just takes other dice that alternate dice, and he will add his results. So what I've started doing is I will roll into one part of my dice tray, and I will take alternately colored dice, and I will put them into the top slot. So I can say to my opponent, without having ever touched the dice, here's my initial roll. Here's everything I've added. So if there's any question, they can look at the initial roll and check everything. So that way, my dice are never even touched, and my opponent never has to worry about, oh, did he knock a die over? Did he count them correctly? They're never picked up. So that, to me, I really like that tip from Justin, because again, it helps you play with impunity.
Yeah, I think that's a really great suggestion of having those added dice in a separate area. That reminds me, I played a really great game at a local event recently with Moth Eric. Shout out to him. He played. I played Vader Cam to his Hask, his Iden list. I think it was Iden Grand Inquisitor. Anyways, he ends up winning this game, but there was a moment where he made an attack, and we were going through everything, and we get a little bit into this attack after Ben Dice have rolled, like he's mulling over his tree options, and he asks, did he add his Hask dice? And honestly, neither of us could remember if he had. It was just this awkward situation of, Eric's great. It was obvious that he wasn't trying to like cheat me or anything. I wasn't trying to do the same to him. Like I wasn't trying to say, hey, you hadn't I didn't know if he had added it or not, right? But it just created this confusion. So I like having this like, oh, here's a separate spot for the dice. That's a really great idea, Scott.
Yeah, yeah. And one thing I think is just kind of generally important, and your TO will probably say this, just agree on everything before the game starts. If
Yeah.
there's discrepancies, oftentimes it is the reality in a tournament, a big tournament, that there's going to be third party terrain. And those are going to have features that you're going to need to agree on. Is this an egress point? Does this block movement? Does this block line of sight? Agree on all of that. I'll tell my opponent, hey, I'm going to roll on my dice tray. If it rolls out, I'm going to re-roll it. If it does this, I'm going to do this. This is where I do this. Whatever you do is fine.
Yeah.
Like if you say I'm going to roll my dice behind my tree, I'll never let you see it, and you're just gonna have to trust me. If they agree to it, whatever, right? It's all about agreeance, right? And if they're cool with it, because you do not want to get in the situation where 45 minutes into an intense game, there is a debate on whether or not a ladder goes to a certain place because you cannot
Yes.
be objective at that point.
Mm-hmm.
You just can't. And so, just best practice anything that is of dispute, anything that you're going to do that is not explicitly in the rules or the conduct that you're going to, how you roll your dice or whatever, just agree on it before you start.
Yeah, that's an excellent shout out. Like,
Yeah,
go over ingress points, go over whether terrain is blocking or not. Like, is if there's a shove, are we counting this little overhang on the building as stopping the shove? Just small things like that are going to make it are going to reduce the tension in game when that comes up.
absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about, and this is kind of a big part of why I wanted to have this episode is let's talk about cheating, let's talk about foul play, and how do you deal with it. So let's first off talk about kind of what the different kinds of forms of cheating are. So some pretty easy ones: deck stacking, right? If
Mm-hmm.
your opponent does not shuffle their deck, or they do a false shuffle or a false cut, or they palm a card or put a card on top and they do a false shuffle, anything like that, all of that is deck stacking. It is the oldest trick in the book. It happens in Magic, it happens in every TCG. Because of the way Shatterport works, it can happen here too. So Sam, obviously we've kind of talked about this. It was pretty easy. Offer to have your deck cut your opponent's deck.
Yep.
That solves the problem pretty easily. Now, obviously, if your opponent refuses to have their deck cut, then there's not a lot you can do about that. And again, it is not, unless the tournament specifically says you must let your deck be cut like that. That's not, correct me if I'm wrong, Sam. AMG rules do not require a deck cut. So unless your TO of your tournament has added that as a local tournament rule, it is something that you are just hoping your opponent has the courtesy to do with you.
That is correct. AMG rules do not require a deck cut, so a deck cut is optional, but I think it is a best practice for creating that trusted atmosphere and creating an environment where both players feel, I guess, safe is the word to play an honest game of Shatterpoint.
Yeah. Now, it is the case that oftentimes deck stacking is, I think, a little bit less likely with the prevalence of Iden Moth and just Iden in general. Having her a Shatterpoint on top is maybe something that people would try to do, and there's certain lists that maybe want certain cards to go earlier or later. But for the most part, because Shatterpoint's a very opportunistic game, I don't see this being a huge problem outside of, again, if you're going against like an Iden player and they get Iden as their first activation all the time, every time, You know, they went 7 rounds, and every time they got Iden or Shatterpoint. That could just be amazing luck, but it's something to think about.
Yeah,
Yep.
true,
Uh,
true.
yep. So the next kind of cheating that you might see is dice fixing. So this is your opponent rolls their dice, and maybe their hand slips, or they kind of, while picking it up, that failure suddenly turned into a crit or an expertise or a hit. And that's kind of one form, but we also have seen where people will just report their results. I have heard stories where somebody reported with their results, and a judge was looking at them and went, "Yeah, that's not what you got, dude. Like, you could not have gotten that many results. You could have got that. Like, you don't have that many expertise." So sometimes people misreporting. I have encountered this in a game. I did see someone change their die result after I'd seen it. I did let them know that I noticed it. I did not call a judge in that time, and I should have. But I have encountered this before. Um, Now, obviously, I think you as a player can prevent yourself from being on suspicion with kind of the ways that we've talked about using our dice and not touching them, having your opponent verify them. But Sam, what do you feel like you can do in a situation if you notice an opponent dice fixer? Like, how do you keep mindful of that?
Yeah, so I think that this is probably one of the highest intensity situations you could find yourself in a game of Shatterpoint, right? Noticing that somebody has switched a dice on you, and I I think that it's really hard to figure out what you're going to do if you don't already have a plan for how you're going to handle such a situation. And planning for someone cheating isn't something that, like, nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to go into a tournament experience and say, like, hey, I know what I'm going to do in case people cheat. But I think it the unfortunate reality of gaming is that it happens and that we should have plans. And as I've thought about that more, it's like, okay, I have a plan. If I see it, I'm going to say, hey, I saw this result and I'm going to call a judge. And having that spoken aloud here as my plan, right? Having that going into an event that's my plan, I think allows me to follow through with that. Because I think it's hard. I know it's hard for me as a conflict avoidant person to gather my courage to call a judge in that situation unless I've already planned to call a judge if that happens.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think sometimes the way you couch it, because calling a judge in those situations, like in the scenario I was in, it was really blatant. And my opponent was like, "Oh, okay." And like kind of was a little bit like, "Oh, he got caught, so he didn't really fight me." So he kind of admitted it, but kind of didn't. But calling a judge is sort of tantamount to accusing someone of cheating, right? In those scenarios. And people can feel really reticent to do that. And the way I'd say it is like, "Hey, uh, this is what I saw. I'm going to call a judge just to put that on record. I'm not saying it might have been an accident, it might have been a thing. I'm not gonna like put intent there, but I would like to have that on record just in case it happens again." For me, it's a situation of I'm not accusing you of anything, but I want this on record just in case. And go
I
ahead.
think that's an excellent point, Scott. And I do want to say there are situations where people accidentally bump a dice or they actually miscount or they look at the wrong expertise chart and so they tell you the wrong results or add something wrong. And that's not always ill will, but still in those situations, it's like a referee. Somebody has made a mistake, call over the judge, get it on record. You can, as you said, I think saying like, hey, this isn't story, but I want it on record in case it happens again. And I think that is a good plan to have. And realize if you're the person who had that happen to you, you misread an expertise chart, you bumped a dice, and you weren't trying to cheat, I think it's important to realize that judge calls in those situations are important to ensure the competitive integrity across the game, right? That the more times people are willing to make those type of calls, just the less actual cheating will happen in the game of Shatterpoint.
Yeah. And also, you don't have to worry about that because you're definitely going to buy a dice tray with multiple areas and not touch your dice and just add modifications later, right? You're going to use our best practices. Yeah.
I'm gonna have that two areas now. It's gonna be great.
Yeah, it is. It really is. I've been doing it in my games, and it's very nice. Uh, so the kind of the next piece is slow play, which is not. It's one of those kind of like I'm not going to call it a gray area because it is kind of cheating. Like it's cheating, but like it is not as explicit, and it is way harder to evaluate,
Yeah,
and it is also way harder to police. And it's actually really easy to resolve if your tournament has chess clocks, but AMG explicitly bans chess clocks. They don't
yeah,
like it. They came from War Machine, and they're like, chess clocks ruined that game. And so I respect that. We did chess clocks at our very first Sci-Fi Invitational because we wanted to kind of compensate for slow play. Some people loved them, some people hated them, but it very effectively eliminated slow play as an issue. But it is definitely something that you will see with, people waiting for mission critical or kind of slow play so you don't get to a next struggle. But it is hard to identify sometimes, right? So, Sam, how do you evaluate, like, what are the things that you look for in your opponent's decision which to determine, like, hey, they're agonizing over a decision that's important and they need to take their time versus this person is just stalling?
yeah. It's really hard to tell. So I wanted to note a couple of things here that the AMG rule system isn't chess, and so the expectation isn't that both players get exactly equal time, but that they get equitable. But it's more so a community practice best standard that people get equitable use of time and that somebody isn't using time as a factor to gain them an advantage, right? That's when it becomes cheating. When somebody's using time to gain them an advantage that they shouldn't have otherwise. And I don't and in board gaming, people make decisions at different speeds. And that's normal and that's okay. And so I don't want someone who tends towards playing slower feel like we were saying, hey, this person is cheating with slow play. So I want to kind of put out that caveat at the beginning here. And I think it's the main things to note about slow play are how to look for how play changes over the course of the game. So if you're coming up to mission critical and somebody's been moving at a pretty regular pace and then they start and they slow down significantly right at about that time without like another reason why, like without like drawing a Shatterpoint card, and you have to think, okay, how am I going to use the Shatterpoint card? Because oftentimes I found in Shatterpoint those are times where the pace of the game naturally slows down when people make the decision of what am I going to Shatterpoint. So it's just looking for irregularities in the pattern of play across the course of the game at critical moments.
Absolutely. And I think one of the difficulties is evaluating critical moments, right? When is a decision really important? If you're an experienced veteran player, it's pretty easy to tell when it's like, okay, this is really important. This is the break point. And you can have a situation where, hey, my opponent is taking a long time to make a decision that's really obvious what they should do. But it's hard because something that is obvious to you may not be obvious to them. And that does
Yeah,
not constitute slow play on their end. They might just be figuring something out because they process, as you put it, Sam, in board games, people process at different speeds, right? I played against an opponent in a recent game who, like, our game went to time because they were a pretty slow player that thought through a lot of stuff, but they also were playing a list they were less, you know, with. They agonized over a lot of decisions. but I never really felt like they were slow playing. One, because I didn't feel like it was to their benefit because I was up, but also just because it kind of like I could kind of just tell that they were trying to suss out what the right thing to do was because they were in difficult situations.
Yeah.
And so I think if your opponent is like really on the up, like they're ahead and they're kind of kicking your butt and they're playing slow, it's like, okay, well, maybe they're trying to preserve their lead via slow play, but it's tough. It's tough. If you come across it, I think there's not a lot of mechanisms to address it. Obviously, if you have a pretty egregious instance, call the judge over. I think my opponent is slow playing, is stalling. Here's my reasoning. Here's why. The judge is just going to give a warning, but it's something. And it also means that if later in the day they get called for slow play again, then the judge has something. Because again, it comes down to if the judge gets called once, it's a warning. But if they get called and it's like, hey, you've played 3 games and each of your opponents has called you out for slow play, like then that becomes something. So there's something there.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think most of the time it's a situation where you can ask your opponent, say, hey, I totally respect this difficult decision. I do think, like, in the interest of time, like, for play, like, could you make a decision? Like, I think just being polite and asking your opponent, just saying, hey, I think this has been a reasonable amount of time with which to make this decision. And if your opponent says, no, I need more time, and they argue with you, then you can call a judge at that point and say, hey, I think this has been a reasonable amount of time and they're refusing to make a decision. And then you kind of go from there. And again, it's a situation where it might feel awkward, but call a judge.
Yeah. And I think that part of the purpose of this episode is so that you have plans of what to do if the situation comes up. Because hopefully, for people out there, they never hit these circumstances. But somebody will. And I do want to also note that a game just going to time or hitting mission critical or that doesn't happen be, only because somebody cheated or was slow playing you in order to cheat you, right? And so that's part of why it makes it so hard is that games of Shatterpoint sometimes go to time. That's just what happens. Sometimes, we hit these yeah, so sometimes that just happens in a normal game of Shatterpoint where people are making lots of decisions. But having a plan of what to do if you feel like, hey, these decisions seem to be irregular, they're elongating how long a turn is taking right before we're going to time, because if the game goes to time and you're the player whose turn it ends, you are significantly more likely to win that game because of the wonky tiebreaker rules. In those situations, I think it's important to know, hey, how am I going to handle it? And how am I going to handle it if somebody seems to be doing something not on the up and up in regards to using their time as a mechanism to win the game?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a great point you made, Sam, which is sometimes the virtue is just have it going in with a game plan of like, what am I going to do if this happens? And I want to assure people, like, I wanted to do this because I think it's good etiquette for us. Like, but I think the important thing here is that I want people to take away from this is like our best practices for what you should be doing.
Yeah.
Because I'll be honest, I've played a lot of tournament games now, and obviously, I mentioned that I encountered cheating. It has only been in one game. The vast majority of players play with integrity. They're not going to be slow playing. They're not going to be cheating, deck stacking. But it is something that exists in the community. You've heard about. You may even have heard about it or know someone who's encountered it or been a victim of it yourself. And so we just want people to be prepared and knowledgeable about that because you know, the more vigilant we are, the less likely people are to attempt it, and we can have zero cheating in the community, which would be the ideal,
Yeah.
right? Uh, so, I kind of the final piece, unless you can think of any other cheating example, Sam. And this one I think is particularly because some people do not necessarily think about this as being cheating, but it is very clearly cheating in my mind. Is collusion. So I actually had this situation not in Shatterpoint, but in Imperial Assault happened to me, and I won't name any names, but I was playing in a tournament at a regional, And these regionals, they come with prizes and they come with cool stuff. So there's reasons to kind of make it. And my last round, I was undefeated going into my final Swiss round, and I got matched against a friend. And he said, "Hey, you're gonna make the cut whether or not you win or lose. So let's play this out. And if you're gonna win, why don't you just concede at the end so that we can both make the cut?" And I went, "Oh, okay." Like I thought, yeah, that makes sense. And then we start playing, and I think about it for like 5 seconds, and I'm just like, "Hey, no, I've changed my mind there because I just realized that's deeply unfair to every other person who like is playing because you would be making the cut because you had a friend,
Yeah.
and like that kind of screws someone else out of making the cut that tried hard for it. So that's a pretty good example for people who don't know collusion. Collusion is essentially working with another player or asking another player to concede or manipulate the events of the game in order to improve your overall tournament performance. Um, so Sam, kind of what are your thoughts about that and kind of what someone should do? Like, how do you spot it and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, so I've had similar experience as you have, across my gaming, uh, tenure career, I should say. And I initially had very much a similar response because I didn't have a plan for it. It was like, yeah, and then after thinking about it, it's like, oh no, that is wrong, right? And so, um, again, have a plan. Just realize, hey, that's unfair to everyone else. We can't have that happening. And it's something that comes across if you're not like prepared for it. I think that there's kind of this natural response of like, oh yeah, I'll help my friend. But then once you've like stopped and you've thought about it for, you've had a couple minutes to think it over, you realize, oh no, that's inherently unfair and cheating to do that, right? And that so, like, best practices to handle it is one, never ask it of your opponent. And if somebody asks it of you, decline and even like state your reasons for why you're declining. Like, hey, I'm not going to do that. That's inherently unfair to everyone here at this competition and breaks the competitive integrity of the tournament, right? And so again, it's all about having a plan, knowing how to respond. Because I think if that for me, like had I like understood all these things like in that initial moment, it would have saved me like a lot of like internal stress of like I agreed to something and then I have to say no, we can't actually do that, right? So it can be stressful, but just make sure that you are living up to standards of fair play that you've set for yourself and have a plan for how to deal with it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would say that if someone does come to you, your opponent in a match as solution, I don't know that you need to call a judge to the table right then, but I would absolutely after the match go to a judge and say, "Hey, I want you to know that this happened,"
Yeah.
because that allows the judge to be vigilant. Um, if they go to, that person's next table or they can talk to them, or if they hear about it again, then they can take appropriate action. It might be the case. Some people would say you should call the judge right then and there because collusion should be something that like gets you kicked out of the tournament or attempted collusion in this case. And for me, I feel like in those situations where you know it, you address it after the fact, I think that's sufficient. But I don't know, Sam. Would you feel it's better to call a judge to the table right when it happens, or kind of speak to him after the fact, or a third option?
Probably after the fact. I think part of it is that the person might not just like immediately think of it as something that they're breaking the rules, right? They're like they haven't thought about like maybe like our initial reactions at first where it's like, oh yeah, but then they haven't spent like time needed to think through like the moral implications of it, right? And so just responding to the initial and say like, hey, no, I won't, and these are the reasons why. I think you can kind of perhaps gauge by their reaction uh, whether or not a judge needs to be called. But I would typically just talk to a judge afterwards.
Yeah, no, I think the idea of like they may not realize what they're doing is cheating is
Yeah,
probably a good enough justification to me to talk to a judge, because again, if they try it again, and I think what that does mean is that if you're going to talk to a judge after the fact, not directly at that moment, I do actually think that does put an onus on you to say, hey, that is considered cheating. Just so you know, like
yeah.
if you ask your opponent to do that, that is a form of cheating, and that will get you penalized. So and then yeah, just follow up with the judge after. But yeah, um, so yeah, I mean, those are kind of the kinds of cheating that kind of we see that has happened in Shatterpoint or can happen in Shatterpoint. Any last kind of thoughts, Sam, kind of on best practices or how to deal with cheaters, how to be a good tournament guest and participant?
I don't necessarily have more thoughts, but I would love to hear other people's thoughts on what maybe are some other best practices that they do to create a trusted environment that can, help us all. Because it's always a thing that I think we can learn and improve and grow as a community, help create these environments. And I'd love to hear other people's ideas and experiences of what helps make them feel comfortable and what they do to make others feel comfortable.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I called out like Justin and Daimyo Matt gave me great ideas for how to be a better player, demonstrating more integrity and just showing good practices there. Um, I will also say that, generally speaking, yeah, we want to be good sportsmen and sportswomen and people, uh, and comport ourselves well in these tournaments, recognize that this is a game, luck is a factor. uh, you earned your victory, but so did your opponent, and luck can be a factor, and that's okay. Luck is a thing that you have to manage in games, and judges are your friends. Do not be
Yeah.
afraid to call a judge. That is what they are there for, and kind of go in with a game plan. Uh, I think the worst thing that you can do if you encounter cheating is to pick up all your models and get mad and give them the win, because you are rewarding them. You are rewarding them with a win for cheating. Uh, Now, if you pick up your models, go to a judge and say, hey, I am not playing this game because my opponent has cheated, I would call the judge first, um, and say, hey, I've noticed some blatant cheating. I'm not going to keep playing. Then that's when you do it. But I generally think allow a judge to handle that kind of stuff. People can get really upset and heated. And I think that is totally justifiable and understandable. I just think always when we give into that and pick up our models and leave the table and do a forfeit, then we reward cheaters. We reward them with our complicity in their actions and giving them that win. And I just wouldn't do it.
Yeah, great thought, Scott. I love it. I do want
Yeah.
to say to the listeners out there, we've spent a lot talking about like creating this trusted atmosphere. We've talked about how to handle cheating, how to handle the plan. We touched a little bit about being a good sport, winning and losing. If you want to dive more into that aspect, being a good sport, handling tilt and such, the Red Mandos have a really we have some really good thoughts on that. I think Red Mando 2 is a psychologist. Kenny and I were on there briefly for one episode, and we talked a little bit about that with them, and they had some really great and interesting insights into that. So if you're interested in thinking more about that aspect of creating welcoming environments and tournaments, I highly recommend you go check out their episode or episodes that they have talking about that.
Yeah, great call out. Well, all right. Well, Sam, I think that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you so much for listening. Everyone, please come and join us on the Slack and, tell us about kind of the things that you like to do. Also just come hang out and list build and show off your models. But yeah, thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good night.